Picture this. You're the King of England. You've got castles, crowns, oaths of loyalty, and an entire political system built around the idea that your word is basically law. And what do you do with that power? You pick fights with your own nobles, you pick a fight with the church, you lose huge chunks of your family's empire, you squeeze the country for money like it's a lemon that personally offended you. And then you act shocked when everyone around you decides, in unison, that they'd rather risk civil war than tolerate you for one more week. That's today's story. Because today on Royal Idiots, we're talking about King John of England, the man whose reign was such a mess that his angry barons essentially looked at each other and said, "Fine. If he can't behave, we're going to invent limits." And out of that chaos, we get one of the most famous documents in political history, Magna Carta. Welcome to Royal Idiots, the podcast where we explore the most powerful bad decisions in history. I'm your host, Melissa, and today we're looking at the life of King John, the ruler whose talent wasn't conquest or diplomacy or statecraft. It was managing to anger literally everyone. And if you've ever wondered how medieval politics actually worked, why the Magna Carta mattered, or how one king's bad judgment helped push England toward constitutional government, you're in exactly the right place. Before we can blame John for everything, we need to understand the world he lived in. This is England in the late 1100s and early 1200s, and England is only part of the story. Because John isn't just inheriting a neat little island kingdom. He's part of the Angevin dynasty, a family that, at its height, controlled a sprawling patchwork of territories. England, large parts of Ireland and Wales under varying degrees of control, and huge lands in France, Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, depending on which relative is currently alive, married, or in open rebellion. This is basically a medieval multinational corporation held together by family ties, feudal contracts, and constant anxiety. The king is powerful, yes, but he's not an absolute monarch in the modern sense. He depends on barons for soldiers, on sheriffs and local officials for taxes, and, crucially, on legitimacy. If your major nobles decide you're not worth it anymore, your throne turns into a wobbly chair very fast. And there's one more major player we have to name, the church. In medieval Europe, the church isn't just spiritual life, it's politics, law, education, money, and international prestige. When you fight the Pope, you're not just getting into a theological argument. You're messing with the entire system that tells people your rule is blessed and valid. So this is the environment John steps into. A fragile empire, a culture of personal loyalty and honor, and a political reality where your team can absolutely quit on you if you keep treating them like garbage. Now let's meet our main character. John is born in 1166, the youngest son of Henry II of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine. And if those names sound like heavyweights, they are. Henry II rebuilt royal power after a period of chaos, and Eleanor was one of the most formidable political figures of the Middle Ages. John is growing up in a family where ambition is normal and betrayal is practically a hobby. But here's John's problem. He's the youngest. In a world where land equals power, being the youngest son can mean you get not much. His older brothers are getting the big, shiny inheritances. John's early nickname in some traditions is Lackland, which tells you everything about how his prospects looked. And that insecurity matters, because it shapes him. John is surrounded by siblings with titles, territories, and reputations to protect. He's the one who has to claw for relevance. And if you're the kind of person who handles insecurity by becoming strategic and charming, great. But if you handle it by becoming suspicious, spiteful, and obsessed with control, that's how you get a King John. When John is young, the family drama is constant. Henry II's sons rebel against him. Alliances shift. Marriages are political weapons. And John learns a lesson that will define him. Trust is scarce, loyalty is negotiable, and power is something you take and hold tightly, because someone else is always trying to take it from you. Eventually, though, the line of inheritance clears in a grimly medieval way. People die. John's older brother Richard the Lionheart becomes king. Richard is the warrior king, the crusader, the legend. And John is the guy back home, watching, waiting, and occasionally making moves that suggest he'd be perfectly happy if the waiting ended sooner than later. But then, in 1199, Richard dies. And suddenly, John isn't the spare anymore. Here's the king. John's rise to power is less triumphant coronation and more complicated family inheritance dispute with swords. When Richard dies, John has a major rival, Arthur of Brittany, a teenage nephew with a legitimate claim and supporters, especially in French territories. So right from the start, John's rule is contested. John does become King of England, and he does gain control of the Angevin lands, to an extent. But controlling a patchwork empire is like trying to hold water in your hands. You need political skill. You need allies. You need people to believe you're worth following. And to be fair, John isn't a complete incompetent in every single area. He can be administratively focused, he understands revenue, and he pays attention to details. If you needed a king to audit accounts, he might be your guy. The problem is that John also seems to have an almost supernatural ability to turn workable situations into personal feuds. He alienates key nobles. He's vindictive. He's quick to punish and slow to reward. He demands loyalty in a system where loyalty is transactional, and then he forgets the transaction part. And then comes the great geopolitical nightmare of his reign, France. Across the Channel is Philip II of France, a king who is, unlike John, extremely effective. Philip's goal is simple: break the Angevin hold on French land and bring those territories under French control. And he knows exactly how to do it: exploit disputes, peel away allies, and force John into mistakes. John has a choice here. He can play the long game, build coalitions, negotiate, secure loyalty, and pick battles carefully. Or he can do what he repeatedly does: escalate, antagonize, and then scramble when the consequences arrive. Over the early years of John's reign, the French territories start slipping away. Normandy, an enormous, symbolically important chunk of the dynasty's power base, falls in 1204. Think about that. The kings of England since 1066 have been tied to Normandy. Losing it is not just a strategic loss, it's a prestige catastrophe. And if you're a baron with lands in both England and France, this isn't some distant chess move. This is your income, your inheritance, your family's future. John is not just losing territory, he's losing the confidence of the people he needs most. All of that sets the stage for the defining disaster. The moment where John goes from troubled ruler to historic cautionary tale. So let's get to it. The idiot moment. Because John doesn't just lose land. He responds to losing land in the worst possible way, by attempting to reassert control through pressure, punishment, and relentless money grabbing, while simultaneously picking unnecessary fights that make his political isolation even worse. Here's the basic logic John seems to adopt: if loyalty is slipping, tighten the screws. If nobles are unhappy, demand more obedience. If finances are strained, tax harder. If the church isn't cooperating, bully it. It is, to put it kindly, not a winning strategy. Let's start with the church conflict, because it's one of John's most spectacular self-inflicted wounds. When the Archbishop of Canterbury dies, there's a dispute over who gets to replace him. This isn't just a religious appointment. Canterbury is massively influential. John wants his candidate. The monks and church officials want theirs. And the Pope, Innocent III, who is not someone you want as an enemy, backs a man named Stephen Langton. John refuses. Now, a smarter king might negotiate. He might accept Langton and look for leverage elsewhere. Or at least avoid turning this into a full-blown crisis. John, however, chooses confrontation. The Pope responds with an interdict, essentially shutting down many church services in England. Imagine being a medieval person who believes your spiritual life and eternity are directly connected to the church, and then suddenly marriages, burials, and sacraments are disrupted, because your king is arguing with the Pope. That creates immediate social and political pressure. John doesn't back down. So Innocent III escalates. John is excommunicated. And John's reaction is basically, fine. He confiscates church property and squeezes revenue from it. This is the part where John accidentally reveals what kind of king he is. For him, even a spiritual crisis becomes a financial opportunity. But it's also a huge gamble. Because excommunication undermines legitimacy. It gives your enemies a moral argument. It encourages rebellion. And it opens the door for the French king to present himself as the Pope's partner in fixing England's leadership problem. Which brings us back to the money. War is expensive. Trying to reclaim lost French lands is very expensive. And John needs funds. So he leans hard on feudal revenues, scutages, fines, fees, and payments demanded in exchange for royal favor or even basic justice. The barons don't just feel taxed, they feel shaken down. And in a feudal system, that resentment is combustible. Your nobles aren't ordinary taxpayers. They're armed power brokers with castles and private soldiers. John manages to take that resentment and multiply it by being personally abrasive. He punishes barons, demands hostages, and is widely seen as unpredictable. And then there's the darkest cloud hanging over him, the fate of his nephew Arthur. Arthur, remember, is the rival claimant. He's captured, and then he disappears. People at the time strongly suspect John arranged his death. Whether John personally did anything or ordered it, the perception is devastating. It's not just politically convenient. It's seen as a violation of kinship, honor, and the basic rules of legitimacy. It makes it easier for John's enemies to say, "This man cannot be trusted with power." So by the time John tries to recover his reputation and lands, he's in a terrible position. He's lost Normandy. He's created enemies among the barons. He's antagonized the church. He's made himself morally suspect. And he's running the country like a revenue extraction machine. Then, in 1214, John attempts a major military effort to regain his French territories. It's complicated, involving allies and campaigns, but the headline is simple: it doesn't work. The broader coalition against France collapses after a major defeat at the Battle of Bouvines. This is the moment where the barons look at John and realize, we've paid, we've suffered, we've watched him lose, and there is no payoff coming. There's just more demands. And that's when the opposition stops being grumbling and starts being organized. The barons begin to rebel. They're not just mad. They have a plan. And what they want is something kings hate: limits. Unsurprisingly, John's choices finally produce a full-scale crisis. By 1215, a group of barons has effectively had enough and is willing to use force. They capture London, which is a huge symbolic and strategic blow. If the capital is against you, you're not in charge. You're a guy with a crown arguing with reality. John, cornered, has to negotiate. And out of that negotiation comes Magna Carta. Now, let's be clear. This isn't a democratic manifesto written for all people everywhere. It's a messy, practical document designed to protect the interests of the elite, at least at first. But it contains something revolutionary for its time. The idea that the king is not above the law, and that there are rules he must follow. It addresses issues the barons care about: unfair fines, arbitrary imprisonment, abuses by royal officials, and the king's habit of treating justice like a product you can buy. And it creates a mechanism, however awkward, for enforcing the agreement. John signs it. Or rather, he seals it. And you might think, okay, crisis averted. But remember who we're talking about. John does not see Magna Carta as a binding settlement. He sees it as something he was forced to accept and would obviously try to undo the instant he could. He appeals to the Pope. And Pope Innocent III, who now has reasons to support John, because John eventually submitted to papal authority and made England a papal fief in exchange for backing, declares Magna Carta invalid. Which means the deal collapses. England slides into the First Barons' War. The rebels invite Prince Louis of France to come take the English throne, because that's how bad things have gotten. English nobles would rather import a French prince than tolerate their own king. John spends his final months fighting a civil war, trying to recover ground, and watching his authority disintegrate. He dies in 1216, sick and exhausted, with the kingdom still in turmoil. And in a final twist of medieval dark comedy, his death arguably saves the monarchy. Because his heir, Henry III, is a child. A child king can be guided, negotiated with, and reshaped. The rebels lose momentum. Magna Carta gets reissued in revised forms. And the monarchy survives, partly because John is no longer around to make things worse. So what's John's legacy? Here's the strange thing. King John is remembered as a villain, and not without reason. Even medieval chroniclers who generally like kings tend to describe him as cruel, suspicious, and grasping. Later storytelling traditions, like the Robin Hood legends, turn him into the archetypal bad ruler. But history is rarely tidy, because out of John's failures comes a long-term political shift. Magna Carta becomes more than a peace treaty. Over time, it becomes a symbol. Later generations reinterpret it as a statement about rights and lawful rule. It influences legal tradition. It becomes a reference point in conflicts between crown and parliament. It echoes in political arguments centuries later, well beyond England. And all of that happens not because John was secretly a reformer, he absolutely wasn't, but because he pushed the people around him to the point where they needed a new solution. It's one of those moments where a leader's incompetence forces innovation. The barons didn't sit down and say, "Let's give the world a foundational text." They said, "How do we stop this man from ruining us?" And in solving their immediate problem, they created a tool that would outlive everyone in the room. Now it's time for the royal idiot verdict. So how should we judge King John? On the royal idiot scale, I'm giving him royally dangerous. And I don't say that lightly, because there are kings who were crueler, kings who were lazier, kings who made one catastrophic choice and vanished into history. John's special talent is that he combines multiple failures into a single, self-reinforcing disaster. He loses major territories and fails to win them back. He treats his nobles like enemies and then seems surprised when they act like enemies. He escalates a conflict with the church to the point of national crisis. He relies on financial pressure so aggressively that he turns taxation into personal extortion. And when forced into a compromise that could have stabilized his reign, he tries to undo it immediately, triggering civil war. The end result is astonishing. John's reign is so destabilizing that it helps produce a document limiting royal power, and it sets England on a path toward more constrained monarchy. He didn't mean to. He didn't want to. But he earned it anyway. If your barons look you in the eye and say, "We're going to put the rules in writing because we can't trust you," that is a level of failure that deserves a special crown of its own. Next time on Royal Idiots, we'll explore the story of Henry II of England, the patriarch of this family drama. If you enjoyed this episode, follow the podcast wherever you get your podcasts or on YouTube and share it with a fellow history fan. And the next time you hear someone say, Magna Carta, remember, behind that famous name is a king who managed to make himself so intolerable that constitutional government started to look like the reasonable option.